My life goes on in endless song above earth's lamentation. I hear the real, though far off hymn that hails a new creation. Through all the tumult and the strife, I hear its music ringing. It sounds an echo in my soul. How can I keep from singing? While though the tempest loudly roars, I hear the truth it liveth, and though the darkness round me close, songs in the night it giveth. No storm can shake my inmost calm, while to that rock I'm clinging, since love is Lord of heaven and earth. How can I keep from singing? When tyrants tremble in their fear and hear their death knell ringing, when friends rejoice both far and near, how can I keep from singing? In prison cell and dungeon vile, our thoughts to them are winging. When friends by shame are undefiled, how can I keep from singing? Good morning, friends. Thank you for indulging me. I'm glad I don't have to mask while I talk because my glasses fog up and I can't see. I'm 53 years old now, and these are, yes, progressives. My name is Magruder. I'm a member of Strawberry Creek Friends meeting in Berkeley, California. I'm a cradle Quaker, and I work as a palliative care chaplain at a very large urban hospital, what sometimes is called a safety net hospital, where you go when you don't have options. And for decades, I've been talking with Quakers and others about the gathering catastrophe of climate change and social injustice, the way the two are enmeshed, and also the decline of the Society of Friends. Sounds pretty gloomy, I know. My day job as a hospital chaplain entails sitting at the feet of those very powerful teachers that were named in Buddhist tradition of old age, sickness, and death. In my hospital, a Trauma One Center, I also get to sit at the feet of a very frequent guest lecturer, trauma. The most frequent response I get when I tell people my job, Marianne Percy will know this well, is, "Oh, I could never do that. So much suffering." I might seem then like an unlikely person to talk to you about hope, but that's precisely the ministry that I've been carrying. We can and must find deep hope in these optimistical times. What does it mean to be optimistical, I hear you asking? How do I practice optimisticism? Can I be an optimistic if I'm not naturally an optimist? Is Chaplain Carl just making up words? All will be revealed. Optimisticism is what enabled St. Francis to give up his fortune and his position to follow Christ. And it's why Jesus fell with his face to the ground, as it says in the gospel, and said, "Papa." He says, "Abba." That's how he addresses God. It's not Father, it's Papa. It's familiar. "Papa, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." before he went to the cross. Her optimisticism is what enabled Eddie Hillesum to pray for the young Nazi officers who eventually murdered her at Auschwitz, saying, "It still all comes down to the same thing. Life is beautiful, and I believe in God, and I want to be there right in the thick of what people call horror, and still be able to say, life is beautiful." Optimisticism can be heard in Martin Luther King's mountaintop speech the day before he too was crucified. "I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land," he said. It's the everyday optimisticism of Dorothy Day that enabled her to live her life in service to the poor, despite the meager rewards and the intractability of what the optimist Gandhi called the most pernicious form of violence, poverty. It's the optimistical force of God as love that John Woolman refers to when he writes, "Love was the first motion." When we surrender enough of our fears, our worries, our doubts, our resentments, judgment, and control to heed Isaac Pennington and sink down to the seed, we find that we rest in spirit so completely that we cannot help but rejoice and hope and work as we are led. And ours is an optimistical faith. No storm can shake my inmost calm, when to that rock I'm clinging. It's an optimistical rock. I want to say a few things about my talk today. First, it's a real honor and a pleasure to be here among you. Thank you so much for inviting me to be your friend in residence. I find the process of gestating ministry to be pretty torturous, but not without some rewards to my own spiritual deepening. It requires that, so that's a benefit. I also want to make visible my spiritual accompaniment. I have an anchor committee from Strawberry Creek Meeting. We've been meeting together since 2009, I think. My elder, Valerie Nutman, is somewhere in the Zoom holding us in the lower right corner, in fact, right there. My spiritual director, Ann Pomeroy, has been an ongoing support and counsel. My NPYM elder and annual session liaison, Bautista, has been very, very helpful. My partner, Mika Estrada, accompanying me on this trip. And I have been collaborating with Jan Ostrom and Mim Coleman in preparation for sojourning with you all. And I spent some very sweet time with NPYM's ministry and council. These relationships are what enable me to stand before you today. I am sort of, if you think about yourself walking in one of these beautiful coastal northwestern forests, I'm the mushroom, okay, that you see above the forest floor. I see there's some biologists in it, some mycologists. But it's these friends and these conversations and these relationships, this prayer and holding in the light, that forms the mycelium, the mycorrhiza net. The exchange of knowing and nutrients, that's where the real action is. That's the neural net of the forest. And that is the real action of which the visible fruit is only a byproduct. Okay? And yes, I did just refer to myself as the visible fruit.
How do you get your t-shirt over your head?
She gave a t-shirt, yeah. The other thing I want to tell you by way of preamble is that I have tried to center this talk for the young folks among us. And as a 53-year-old, sometimes in Quaker circles, people think I'm a young folk. But it's entirely that. I'm well aware that starting with old hymns and addressing a sappy topic like hope is probably cringe, but I'm hoping that there will be some tolerance. In Quaker circles, as I say, I am sometimes considered young myself, but I was born in 1969. So I'm part of the first generation of Americans that was born with legal racial equality. Actual equality is still a work in progress. Despite a very early childhood knowledge of nuclear weapons, racism, poverty, war, sexism, and environmental degradation, thank you, socially engaged Quaker parents. Until 2008, I deeply believed that the world was solving these problems, that progressivism towards peace, equality, and freedom for all was pretty much inevitable, and that I personally would be able to be safe and thrive throughout my adult life, despite having been told in high school that I was Generation X, the first generation of Americans that would be less prosperous than our parents, which we are. Situation was really problematic and dire, but I was blissfully able to ignore it. Now that is what's called false hope. Now many young people today are in a state of despair. You may notice this: ennui, nihilism, denial, rage, hopelessness. Accruing debt for education seems like a trap. A record number of 20-somethings say they don't want to have children because they don't want to subject new humans to the world that they see on the horizon. And the most regrettable vote of no confidence, suicide, is on the rise among young people. If you are feeling suicidal, friends, please reach out. Your ministry and council committee is here to provide pastoral care and to offer spiritual and emotional support. In 2003, 4, 5, I was at the John Woolman School in Nevada City, and we taught a book called The Secret Life of Stuff. Does anyone know this book? All right, it's a manual for a new material world. It's by Julie Hill. It traces the cradle-to-grave ecological footprints of everyday things like TVs, hamburgers, clothing, and cars. And we watched our students growing horror and alarm as they realized that all of their consumer goods and most of their activities contribute to the destruction of the biosphere and the exploitation of people. The reassurance that we could shrink our ecological footprint, perhaps even create a zero waste or steady state material economy, that we could empower labor to organize for better conditions if only we could counter the forces of runaway capitalism with sufficient political will, was weak sauce, and we knew it. In the late 90s, my stepbrother Zachary Moon roped me into doing a week-long summer workshop for Pacific Yearly Meeting kids who were moving up from high school to college. The group of us young adults talked to them about the Valiant 60 and the other early friends, about dynamic witness and the mystical roots of Quakerism, living in integrity and being a people of faith on fire. They asked us, where is this dynamic Quakerism you described? It's not in my monthly meeting. Where can I find it? We have to tell them, it's aspirational. It's possible, but we can't find it either. We're longing for it. There was a first century Jewish teacher who said to his people, the kingdom of heaven is among you. Perhaps the beloved community dwells among you young people and can be brought to fruition. We didn't know that we were saying, perhaps you can save us, give us hope. The young people went into the kitchen, asking us to leave them alone and give them space. We knew that we had let them down, that we had talked about living waters, but not given any that could slake their thirst. Most of those young people cannot be found in Quaker circles today. Perhaps this talk will be an opportunity to deepen dialogue with young people. That's my hope. It's not empowering or fair for older people to strike a wise and magnanimous pose, saying, the younger generation of millennials have such insight and tools at their disposal. We are looking to them to fix the world. That's a cop-out. A musician most of us don't know, the young folks do. Janelle Monáe sings in her song Turntables, if you mess up the kitchen, you should do the dishes. I shouldn't say that. My own eldest child is the same age as those kids that we did that workshop for many years ago, and is heading off to college next month. And though a very kind and caring and smart and generally cheerful person, they have asked me many questions that I didn't have good answers for. And so that's part of my guide in offering this talk. The time for pat answers and rosy blandishments is long past. We must instead heed Rilke's advice and live the questions now. That's what my wrestling has been. Now, I know this is really an appalling amount of preamble, and I apologize. But there's one further thing that I want to add here in the interest of integrity. and that is that I have never been a happy-go-lucky person. The study of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, now leads developmental psychologists to believe that crisis or trauma in the first year of life may be orders of magnitude more difficult to heal than trauma later in childhood. My first year of life was a bit chaotic, with various foster care placements, and although I was adopted by the age of 1 into a stable and loving, perhaps even boring Quaker family, the initial sense that the world is a good and beautiful place where I would be taken care of, my needs would be met with unconditional love abounding, was not seated in me from the earliest days. Mine is a wintry personality, perhaps too governed by the query, what could possibly go wrong? No, seriously, what could possibly go wrong? Living life in this society as a person of color reinforces my sense that danger, injustice, hatred may pop up anywhere at any time. What I mean to say is that I come to this subject of hope through the via negativa, the dark road, the dark night of the soul. We learn the value of things in a very profound way. We experience the lack of them, the lack of friends or love or food or health. The hard start grew my desire for life-bringing hope, which has been my guide on this journey towards deep hope, toward an optimistical faith. I love and sense of awe for the natural world. I appreciated the friend. We were lamenting our utensils just this morning in practice. But also for human love and for the potential of transcendent joy are just too great not to experience despair and grief as I watch humanity turn away from these things again and again. So, let's talk about sorrow, grief, and lamentation. This is the secret place where the road to hope begins. Do you know Rumi's poem, The Guest House?
Yes.
Yeah. This being human is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival. A joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all. Even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture, still treat each guest honorably. They may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. Shallow forms of hope. It's all going to be all right. The free market system will always correct itself. Politics swing from left to right is part of the natural process. Nature is resilient and can repair all this damage. The oncologist says the chemotherapy is working on my metastatic cancer. Science will find a solution. These just don't satisfy. It's not that they aren't ever true, but that they aren't adequate. I believe that we resort to them as an ineffectual hedge against despair and grief. But one of the things I've learned by working with the dying and their loved ones is that despair and grief are not pathologies to be cured, medicated away, overcome with a proverbial stiff upper lip and willpower. Who wants to work that hard? These are waters that we must learn to swim in intentionally, with frequency and solitude and solidarity with others. We must not avoid grief and lamentation, these visitors to our guest house, but welcome and entertain them all, even if they are a crowd of sorrows. When we elect not to feel our grief, we attenuate all feeling, all passion, pathos, what our thinking brains label positive or negative feeling. To be without feeling, to be without pathos, is to be apathetic, to be flat. We cannot hope if we will not grieve. In his work, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, Francis Dweller teaches, and I recommend that book very much, welcoming our sorrow eases the hardened places within us. You have hardened places within you, friend. I have hardened, calcified places within. Allowing them to open and freeing us to once more feel our kinship with the living presence that's all around us. This is deep activism, soul activism, that actually encourages us to connect with the tears of the world. Our own tears flow into the tears of the world. Grief keeps the heart flexible, fluid, and open to others. As such, it becomes a potent support for any other form of activism that we may intend to take. A congested heart, one burdened with unexpressed sorrow, cannot stay open to the world, and consequently cannot be fully available for the healing work that is needed at this time. What are you grieving, friends? And what are we grieving together? Let's take some time now to name some of these losses. Your grief is very tender. You might want to just name it to yourself. Hold it in your heart. Help that heart to soften and open. If a grief would benefit from being shared, please speak it in a word or short phrase into this space, and I will repeat it so it can be heard. And is there a way for them to raise a hand there? Or they could maybe put it in the chat?
You can raise a hand.
Yeah, so let's just take a moment. Grief and sorrow are holy. What sorrow weighs on your heart this morning?
I grieve the certainty of my future because of what's happened with the climate.
Grieving the certainty of a future because of what's happening with the climate.
The lost presence of our children.
The lost presence of our children, not just in this room, but all of COVID.
The dwindling of the religious society of France.
The dwindling of our beloved society and friends, religious society.
Women's agency over our own bodies.
Women's agency over their own bodies.
Childbirth loss and childbirth trauma.
Childbirth loss, childbirth trauma.
My father's death.
I grieve that there's no way for people to put messages in the chat to the whole room.
Someone just did and commented, living in poverty.
Living in poverty.
The death of my husband, Clint.
The death of her husband, Clint.
Another person in the chat. A refusal to provide housing to those who need it.
Our refusal to provide housing for those who need it.
Perhaps 100 million refugees around the world without a home.
Perhaps 100 million refugees around the world without a home.
The sadness and fear that I see in our children.
Sadness and fear that I see in our children.
Big trees.
Big trees.
The inexorable and accelerating destruction of the web of life, which supports all.
The inexorable and accelerating destruction of the web of life that supports all.
The murder of Black boys and men by police.
Murder of Black boys and men, say women and girls, by police.
Sudan.
Yes.
The disaster in Sudan.
The disaster in Sudan.
Hate of the other, in particular homophobia.
Hate of the other, and in particular homophobia.
The divisiveness in our country between conservative, liberal, blue state, red state.
The division in our country between conservatives and liberals, blue states and red states.
Wars and layers of violence fueled by the greed of arms makers and arms merchants.
I think everyone heard that.
No.
No, okay. Wars and violence furthered by arms and arms makers.
The invasion of Ukraine.
The invasion of Ukraine.
I agree for those of us among us who are isolated by disability and simply by being different and being ignored.
For those who are isolated, either by disability or by being different and ignored.
People all over the world who are silenced within prisons, detention centers, refugee camps.
People all over the world who are silenced by being in prisons and detention centers and refugee camps.
The frailty of my 90-year-old mother.
The frailty of my 90-year-old mother.
The growing divide caused by the lack of internet access, and in particular for school-age children.
Growing divide caused by lack of internet access, particularly among school-age children.
The demonizing of others, whether for being trans or a migrant or Republican or a business person.
The othering of, that was so juicy, I got distracted. The othering of
Demonizing.
the demonizing of others, whether they be trans folks or
Republicans.
migrants, Republicans, or business persons.
The possibility that our country will not rise to the challenges which face it and the world.
The possibility that our country will not rise to the challenges that face it and the world. And I feel like we might be missing some chat. Yeah. Okay.
The lingering but pervasive effects of trauma, childhood, that pervades life into adulthood with PTSD.
The threat to our democracy.
The threat to our democracy, living with many illnesses, I see there. Those who do not listen or see. The loss of insects and birds. Better said, the decline of insects and birds. Aging and disability of loved ones. Living in a city with violence and racial and economic injustice. I think you can just.
Okay, just tell everybody online, just unmute if you have something to say.
That would work. But I just want to, if there's something on your heart that you need to share, friends, just let's try to draw this to a conclusion here.
The loss of my daughter and the many that are trapped in the cycle of addiction.
Cycle of addiction, the loss of my daughter, and many more lost. All right. One of the fun things when I became a chaplain was I learned that you have to pray out loud with people. You'll probably try to make some kind of a case for the Quaker, and that's not my tradition, but wouldn't fly. Plus, you would give away a wonderful tool, and it's not our tradition. You know, some of the greatest prayers out loud in the history of religion. So this is a prayer. Divine mystery. Let us hold these sorrows, these losses, this grief with reverence and care. Let us honor our grief, our willingness and ability to experience grief, our brokenheartedness, and the power of love, divine love, which is the seed of our love for one another, bring light to warm, to make visible, to suffuse our suffering, to render it a living sacrament, make it holy. Help us to open wider the channel of compassion within our hearts as we welcome the realization of the suffering in this NPYM body we've heard just a smattering of. That we may journey through this week with Isaac Pennington's invitation, our life is love and peace and tenderness and bearing one with another and forgiving one another and not laying accusations one against another, but praying one for the other and helping one another up with a tender hand. Amen. So, I don't wear a watch, and I'm glad because I have a bad feeling. We're still you don't know how far in this journey we've gone. So, tell me if I'm talking too fast. When we are, there is much to say about grief and much grief work to do. I really want to thank you all for being present to that. This is good and holy work, but I do want to mention that if you're feeling overwhelmed, again, it's often when we pause in our everyday world and our everyday coping, my glass of wine and my Netflix, that we really start to feel our feelings when we go on a retreat and come to our yearly meeting. And so your ministry and council committee stood up earlier, but I'm going to ask them just to stand up again. They've got these old ribbons. And these are people who have been chosen for themselves, offer spiritual and emotional support to individuals into the body. So please do not be embarrassed or ashamed to reach out to these people. Do not imagine that you are not worthy of the care and attention of these friends. No one is an island. Lloyd Wilson likes to say, there is no such thing as a solitary Quaker. We need each other. We are a communal phenomenon. So we started this journey toward hope with grief, and now we must look at the map to see where, or rather when we are. For almost 25 years, I've told classes and meetings and audiences and gatherings, and workshops, and even annual sessions that humanity is standing on the cusp of a radical discontinuity. That's how systems thinkers describe a system where reinforcing feedback loops are about to send the system off the rails. Now, a functioning feedback loop is one where the system maintains its equilibrium, okay? And you do this in the shower. Maybe you did it in the shower this morning. You balance the hot and cold water to get the temperature that you want. We live in an old house, so It's two separate knobs, not one that's clever dots, right? And so, as the hot water heater starts to run out of hot water, and you've been in there too long and you're wasting resources. The hot valve runs through them, so you need more of that hot and less cold in order to maintain your optimum temperature, right? At least until you run out of hot water entirely, or somebody flushes the toilet. So a positive or reinforcing feedback loop is neither good nor bad inherently. Positive doesn't mean good. It means it's reinforcing itself. One person that I work with in a skilled nursing facility experienced these two different reinforcing or positive feedback loops in opposite directions. First, her hip started to hurt, so she moved around less and didn't go hiking in the woods anymore. And this made her depressed. That's the woods are good for you. And so she ate to comfort herself, and she got heavier, which made her hip hurt more. That's a positive feedback loop, even though it wasn't really a positive in her life. I met her in skilled nursing after she'd taken the plunge, summoned her courage, and had her hip replaced, and was doing physical therapy to strengthen her body. With the pain reduced, and with her new Teflon and titanium hip, that would be socket, she did her therapy every day. She was very determined. And then she went home and she kept walking with her walker until she didn't need it anymore and she could return to her long walks in the woods. The trees restored her soul. Don't know this secret about trees, but you gotta go hang out with them more. And as she felt less depressed, she changed to a healthier diet, which helped her to be stronger and more confident. She joined a hiking group. She made new friends. She got a dog and was planning to hike the John Muir Trail the last time I talked to her. That progression is also a positive feedback loop. Now, the feedback loop that we are trapped in globally and at every holonic level is what our wise elder, author, and eco-warrior Joanna Macy calls the industrial growth society, which includes the military-industrial complex, for sure. And one way to describe the governing principle of this system is in the words of the green economist Paul Hawkins. He wrote Green Capitalism. I think his thinking has moved on a little since then, but he said, we have an economy where we steal from the future, sell it in the present, and call it gross domestic product. Natural stores of fish and soil and salt and petroleum, carbon sequestration power, air, water, etc. are stolen from the global commons of the earth itself. Stolen from the global commons and the earth itself. And with the efforts of often exploited workers, it's turned into profit, which accrues, this is the process continuing, this is the system, accrues to an elite few individuals and unaccountable corporations, which are insulated from the destruction that they cause by their actions and use their power to change the rules governing the system to increase more and greater exploitation. Colonization, as described in NPYM's draft minute of support for Indigenous peoples, means stealing resources from Indigenous people all over the world, the damage of which the dominant culture is only now beginning to look at honestly. To the extent that labor is needed to exploit these resources, to develop them, to turn them into what do you call it, gross domestic product, systems of race, gender, class, ableism, and etc. are kept in place to maintain the imbalance of power, which are inherent aspects of the industrial growth society or late-stage capitalism. It's a runaway feedback loop. Where are we going? And why am I in this handbasket? So, systems thinking is part of our Quaker inheritance. You may find that there are interesting ways that you think differently than a lot of people around you. I bet you it's related to a systems approach. The Quaker Kenneth Boulding was a co-founder of general systems theory in the 1950s. But long before that, a systems approach is very clear in the writing of, for instance, John Woolman. You see it in his concern for the poor the New Jersey farmer who escaped religious oppression in Europe to farm in America, where he's had to borrow money at an exorbitant rate, which encourages him to be too hard on his animals, the soil itself, and his own children, as he tries to pay the loan and complex his spiritual life. Do you remember that little section in Woolman's journal? That's a complex system. And he's able to see and to critique. Woolman even glimpsed the injustice of the European farmer on the land, owning land that really belongs to the Powhatan Lenape. But he didn't call that out the way he did slavery. I wonder how things might have been different if he'd been able to call that out. Now, obviously things are not all bad. The system provides citizens of developed countries with very high quality bread and service. Now, charitable gifts of food and gruesome entertainment, bread and circus, were part of how Roman emperors tried to keep their populace complacent. Excessive discontent, you see, creates inefficiencies in the system of wealth and power concentration. So it's important to keep revolutionary tendencies at an optimum rate where they foster infighting amongst interested parties, such as, for instance, poor whites and marginalized people of color. But don't result in a massive, sustained, and coordinated effort, such as an effective Occupy movement or attempts to solve the problem of elites with the guillotine. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, when he managed to sign Social Security, said privately, "I've kept capitalism safe for another generation." We just keep them enough, they'll stay asleep. Yeah. So technology, which is a child of I'm going to put this somewhere else. It's not obvious. Is that funny, you guys? Okay, go a little higher. So technology is a child of ecological exploitation, and it brings us really important real things like better medicine, transportation, communications, entertainment, right, every day. It hooks us into the Industrial Growth Society project and tricks us into believing that without the IGS, these good things would be impossible. Personally, one of the places I'm hooked in is that I'm super excited to see the pictures from the James Webb Space Telescope. Is anyone else like, when's it gonna happen, right? This will actually enable us to look back through time. Right? That's a product of the Industrial Growth Society, as was that Teflon and titanium tip that enabled my friend to live better. Right? So, let's skip a little something and we can get to it in our Q&A tomorrow. I was exposed to this application of systems thinking to the ecological crisis through the work of Joanna Macy, as I mentioned, who writes about the great turning from the Industrial Growth Society to the life-sustaining society. Macy is a student of Kenneth Boulding's general systems theory. Now, I initially paid little attention to how Macy says that the great turning starts. It starts with the great unraveling. When I first read her work, I think I heard the great unraveling as some kind of thrilling adventure, rather than a depressing malaise and an inexorable decline and dissolution and acidity, failure institutions, civil unrest, ecological destruction, autocracy, discrimination, violence, exploitation, and missed opportunities. So when are we now? When are we? It's the great unraveling. Futurist Alex Steffen calls our current era the trans-apocalyptic. We are now transiting the apocalypse, traveling through it, traveling across it. I'll weave these three unraveling contexts through my talk today. They're all in the context of creation. That's the ground that we stand on. But I'm going to talk about the Industrial Growth Society, Society of Threats, and the unraveling and great turning that we see for the individual as death approaches. So we have a great deal of religious mythos and popular culture that's fascinated with the idea of a very short, sharp shock, right? Nuclear annihilation or alien invasion or zombies, whatever it is. In evangelical Christian religion, this is all colloquially called the rapture. And it's rooted in the apocalypse, that is the revelation of John of Patmos. That's the book of Revelation. And it's ushered in by the four horsemen: pestilence, war, famine, and death. Is it any wonder that a faith that sees existence as an anthropocentric linear trajectory that culminates in total annihilation of life on Earth has been so key to forming the doomed culture that fulfills that worldview? In Hollywood, you've got those Terminator movies where AIs destroy the world. I worry about that. What could possibly go wrong? And, The Matrix, Red Dawn, The Road, Independence Day, and all of those films. We think of apocalypse as a disaster, even Teotihuacan, which is an acronym for the end of the world as we know it. REM was wrong. It's the end of the world as we know it, and I do not feel fine. So that's that reference was
I got it.
I got that.
So it's Armageddon, cities on fire. You can ask friends from Portland about cities on fire. But apocalypse doesn't actually mean catastrophe. In New Testament Greek, the word apokalypsis simply means to uncover. Poetically, to lift the veil, to see what was hidden. When the CAT scan shows a tumor, that's apocalypse. That's revelation. It's the lifting of the veil. And when the ultrasound shows a healthy little tiny human being that we're super excited about, that's an apocalypse. It's a revelation. When the jack pine's cones are opened by fire and a new tree takes root, that's revelation. There are four essential characteristics to understand about this trans-apocalyptic time. Great unraveling, or what I call simply the crumbles. It kind of sounds like a yummy dessert. Makes it a little less terrifying. First of all, first characteristic is that there is really no longer the possibility of a non-chaotic transition from where we are to a sustainable reality. What Macy calls this life-sustaining society, and our Quaker religious tradition calls the peaceable kingdom or the peaceable kingdom. We cannot get there from here. We have passed too many off-ramps. Those parallel universes have spun off from ours already, and we are now when we are. There have been, are now, and will be catastrophes, but we are part of an ongoing process which will likely last longer than most of us present today would be alive. The chaos that really started to grab your attention in 2016 will be ongoing. Please remain seated and keep your arms and legs inside the car at all times. Secondly, our ways of knowing, especially for those of us who grew up in analog times, are out of date and won't always accurately describe or predict reality. It's during the crumbles. So this doesn't mean that we should abandon our epistemology. I think we've seen enough of that. I get to believe whatever I want. Alternate facts. It's really been a problem. So we shouldn't abandon that, but we should hold those things a little more loosely and be ready to course correct faster. So the bumper sticker that reminds me of this that I love is don't believe everything you think. Yeah, because I have a problem with that. So we'll have to be quick in our adaptation. And I want to feed in this question of Quakerism again, this stream of Quakerism. Quakerism, rather than chaining itself to a dogma or creeds, 1700 years ago, of fixed beliefs, hitched its chariot to a comet called continuing revelation. There's that word again, revelation, right? It might have been called unending apocalypse. We just keep pulling these veils away. At one point, friends thought music would take us away from spirit. So we pulled the veil on that at the right time. And we oh, look, how about that? So our theology is a process. It's not stasis. And this gives us resilience and creative possibility in the face of this cataclysmic change. Ours is a faith for these times. What are the dwindles? But actually, Third, failure is an option. It's not brave and wise to say, I just know it'll all work out. Pay attention. Disaster is on the menu. We are very, very insulated from disaster. And part of the reason I think we've been so captivated by Ukraine is that we see ourselves. You don't usually see, I gotta just say this. You don't usually see a long line of exhausted people with all of their earthly possessions who look white. That is pretty alarming. Even to me as a person of color, I'm like, well, that's really weird. Usually those lines of miserable looking refugees are brown people. So that's a disaster. It's a real disaster. It's ongoing. It may get worse. Fourth and lastly, this is a generative time. Individually and collectively, we do not change things until they become uncomfortable enough to warrant change. I'm going to respect the tradition of anonymity here, but if you are or know an addict, you know something about keeping doing something until the cost is sufficient to get off the train, right? So we are so resistant to change that we would rather bear these ills we have than fly to others we know not of, as Hamlet suggests. But the great unraveling makes a change trajectory more possible, even as the systems are beginning to fail, precisely because the systems are beginning to fail. It's no coincidence that new ideas and new technologies, okay, our Zoom meeting, new social organization grow out of times of change. Quakerism itself was born at a time of volatile politics, right? It's the king. Well, it's Cromwell. Well, it's the king, you know? You could get whiplash. And there was also at that time a great deal of intellectual and economic, social and religious upheaval. There was even a mini ice age happening in the UK at that time. And so there was food insecurity that hadn't been there before. And these forces created the conditions for a new truth to be published. Oh, we inherit that truth. So volatility is good news. And that brings us to wise hope. Wise hope, deep hope. We started this hope journey in the place of grief and loss, and you can see it there on the map. This is our grief journey map, and it says pit of despond. We've established that the crumbles, though, are the territory that we are going to traverse, all right, in the space-time continuum, and that we are navigating our way to the optimistical. Meanwhile, we need a practical navigation system for our travels. A practical one. It's not mystical. It's not esoteric. It's not elusive, okay? And that is wise hope or deep hope. This is a hope that you can grasp with your thinker, remind yourself about in hard times, gain strength from, and use as a compass or a star map, if you prefer to navigate by the stars, to find your way. Optimistical hope, which is more completely spiritual, is what I will consider last. Need a little water. And I suppose that wise hope begs the question of unwise hope. Hope is not wishing. Hope is not wishing. We should respect wishing enough to say this is a wish and give it its due and not pretend that it's hope. Wishes are important. I love wishes. In fact, I like to turn wishes into prayers. Often when you're working as a palliative care chaplain, you're accompanying people who have serious illness or approaching their death and their families. And it's this sort of gentle support that allows people to approach the awareness of their mortality and their impending death. Right? The hope that many have at the beginning of their illness isn't really hope, it's this wishing that the chemotherapy would work against an advanced and metastatic cancer, wishing that the trial at Stanford would reverse their ALS, wishing for a transplant, but they're too sick to survive, or that never comes. With acceptance of the approach of Santa Muerta, saint death, comes wise hope, deep hoping for those people. I hope to be at my nephew's graduation. I hope that my estranged daughter can hear my regret my heart's apology for being too caught up in my addiction to be there when she needed me. One patient told me that his hope as death approached was to demonstrate grace. Guess what? He didn't. Wise hope is in part rooted in the ancient wisdom of knowing that we don't know what we don't know. Plato credited Socrates as saying the only true wisdom is knowing that you know nothing. This gets easier and easier as you get older. Well, it crumbles as an era when things are too chaotic for us to be certain about many things, including our doom and gloom predictions. You can probably think of many wonderful things that became possible as a result of the disaster of COVID. Right? Many cities suddenly housed unhoused persons in vacant hotels and rentals, which was previously possible. I was asked to give talks to chaplains to write a white paper on how to do pastoral care over Zoom, because suddenly we were providing all of this telemedicine. You might say, I don't prefer it, but it provides quality care to people who otherwise couldn't get it. So maybe it's a mixed bag, but there's some really good stuff that's come with it. In another area of collective life, the cumbersome, overpriced, and excessively elitist institutions of higher education are rapidly changing, making dramatic efforts to be more inclusive, or they're going to be superseded by more affordable, accessible, and egalitarian forms of higher ed. That's a good thing. Nature showed us some of her resilience as we drove and polluted less, right? There were deer walking down the Main Street in places. Also, gardening and pet ownership increased, and that has to be a good thing, right? So part of the problem of our dismal perception of so-called reality is neurological, and part of it is electronical, what I call electronical. We're too prone to believe, those of us with the Wingtree personalities, even worse, too prone to believe what we think, particularly if it's bad. I gave a workshop at Ben Lomond Quaker Center years ago, and afterward my anchor committee said, well, what was the feedback? And I said, oh, people were very positive, liked it. I said, well, but one person wrote, I was hoping for more practical tips on how I might shrink my own ecological footprint and not so much ethics and spirituality. So I had glossed over all those positive comments, but I could quote you the one negative one verbatim. Right? I have hyper-focused on the negative. Our minds have a natural about 1-to-5 ratio focus on threats. And you can see that there would be an evolutionary advantage to that when the threats were bears and poisonous mushrooms and wild groups. But most of us don't have so many immediate physical threats as our ancient ancestors did. Though many of us marginalized folks, I'm going to say this, people of color and persons with disabilities, LGBTQIA folks, female identified persons, we may be feeling much more these days that there are those who mean us direct, immediate, physical, and other harm. When after an Ohio police shot Jalen Walker 60 times, I definitely went into a fugue state. Physically tired, hard to think clearly. So for the most part, modern threats are more abstract, larger, slower. It's one of the reasons it's so hard to get a proportional response to climate change right now. So our heightened sense of fear causes us to be even more hypervigilant, stressed, and miserable. This 1-to-5 ratio. Deep prayer, meditation, and spiritual practice are needed to give us a break, even temporarily, from feeling these threats consciously or unconsciously, from believing what we think. We need the optimistical. Meanwhile, the social media algorithm and attention economy bias is about 1 to 20 good stuff to negative, scary, scandalous bias. Facebook, Twitter, etc. are carefully designed to capitalize on your natural 1-to-5 negativity bias by grabbing our attention and preying on our fears. Combined, the two biases, the 1 to 20 bias of social media and our natural 1-to-5 bias, give you a 1 to 100 bias to focus on everything that's wrong. And also to create division. That's not very helpful. We need this wise hope to cut through the smoke and pall of negativity. I heard some sweet ministry last night about joy. Thank you, thank you. Joy is deeper than happiness and is wide enough to encompass grief. We need to open to joy, to cultivate the conditions for joyfulness. Early friends used an intentionally created hedge, way of living, as part of their faith and their practice, to create the conditions for spiritual wholeness or wellness, right? They had simple dress. Simple dress is sort of reinforced your Quakerness. You couldn't go and get drunk and pinch people on the bottom. You were wearing wedding dresses. It wasn't gonna work, right? It kept you in line, it gave you a reminder. People were encouraged to take some time of daily retirement. It's meditation or contemplative prayer. You think that you are going to achieve a healthy spiritual life without a daily practice, you could get lucky, but you probably would. So, in some fruits of solitude, William Penn recommends wholesome recreation. Right? So we need to add some things to the hedge for our time also, and I want to heartily recommend that having some parameters around use of social media be one of them. Doom scrolling through your Twitter feed is not bringing you closer to God. Now, I don't like the Spices acronym for Quaker testimonies. I think it's too cute and too pat. It's not dynamic or juicy enough. But we can talk about that in the interest group if you like. But if we take the Spices testimonies, I have to say, I often feel the community is the runt of the litter. Right? That's C in the middle of the word, but I mean, we talk about integrity and equality and peace a lot. Sustainability, we don't talk about community all that often. In healthcare, both as burnt out providers over the last few years, and for those who are receiving care, we've begun to understand very real benefits to community. And I'll tell you anecdotally that sitting at the dying bedsides of hundreds of people over the years as they reviewed their lives, the bulk of the list of things that matter comes under the heading of relationships. Intentionally cultivating relationship in a society which is corrosive to those bonds builds our resilience, and it's a part of wise hope. It's part of the purpose and function of our Quaker meetings. So there's big bad stuff going on, sixth grade planetary extinction event, and the dying oceans, and the climate crisis, and the rise of autocracy, the decline of democracy, which we were reading earlier, the wealth distribution inequality, refugees, which we also mentioned, and the red state, blue state divide, increased hate crime, wars, and rumors of wars. In Norway, where my sister lives, people are stocking up on potassium iodide pills in case of nuclear fallout. And indeed, the doomsday clock for nuclear disaster is currently set at 100 seconds to midnight. We do have trouble right here in River City and everywhere else for that matter. But here's the thing. There's awesome stuff going on that the hunter-gatherer fear mind and the look over here social media algorithm distract us from. Take Jackson, Mississippi. You don't know anything about this. I didn't until I was just recently talking to a friend, and he was so excited. Particularly West Jackson, which is predominantly African American. There's an organization called Cooperation Jackson, and it's an umbrella organization which is sponsoring what they call municipalism, which is a kind of direct democracy for towns and cities. And this has given rise to the development of the Ida B. Wells Plaza, where the People's Grocery Cooperative will put a dent in the food desert there. The People's Network for Land and Liberation is decolonizing land ownership. They're teaching workshops on the trifecta of colonialism, supremacy, and capitalism. Cooperation Jackson is planting seeds and building structures that will advance and develop outposts of the life-sustaining society, even as the industrial growth society rots and crumbles, composting into the nutrients needed to build a better world. I did that on purpose. But these are the stories that we also need to hear and celebrate and be involved in. They're made possible as other structures do not. Indeed, story is an essential part of deep hope. Viktor Frankl, who survived Nazi concentration camps, found that he could choose a creative meaning and purpose even in the most horrible conditions, and that this gave hope, motivation, and a sense of autonomy. One story that I tell myself, one way to hold the mythos of this time, is that in fact, the groundswell of new ways of being, which are peaceful, inclusive, subversive, and celebratory, is much stronger than the horrifying, drastic, headline-grabbing actions of power-abusing individuals and institutions. My chaplaincy walked in the Pride Parade in San Francisco here last month, and at one point there was kind of a rise in Market Street, and I could see all the way down, and it was just, rainbow fun everywhere. And I thought, sorry, Supreme Court, this is not going back in the closet. So that's the force that's really happening. What we're witnessing is really just the sort of desperate death throes of an atomistic, individualistic, white supremacist power over worldview that's threatened by the peaceable kingdom breaking through the cracks in the pavement everywhere. Because love wins and nature bats last. Story can also help us to understand concepts that we might lose track of. For instance, I was presenting this very dichotomous notion of good stuff, bad stuff, right? Wise Hope asks, how do you know what is good or bad? My sweetheart loves to tell the story of the philosophical farmer. You may know this story as well.
Yep.
Once upon a time, the farmer had a valuable horse run away. Bad news, said the people. Good news, bad news, who knows, replied the farmer. Later, the horse returned to the farm corral with many wild horses accompanying him. Oh, good news, said the people. Yeah, good news, bad news, who knows, replied the farmer. Sometime after that, the farmer's son was training one of these wild horses, but he fell and badly broke his leg. Bad news, said the people. Good news, bad news, who knows, replied the farmer. And then the army came through town conscripting all the able-bodied young men, and the farmer's son was passed over because of his limb. Good news, said the people. Good news, bad news, who knows, replied the farmer. In a very complex system, things are often not clearly good or bad. Something bad, George Floyd's murder, makes possible a huge increase of awareness of police killings and even some meaningful policy changes in places, awareness of the durability of the racist legacy of this country. Institutions of every kind are expending resources and making changes to increase diversity, inclusion, and equality, including us, right? That's what the Ouch Woe Boots is an iteration of. The realization that our federal government is unlikely to ever provide universal health care, such as can be found in every other developed country in the world, and even some less developed countries, has now motivated California to do it at the state level, right? Even including undocumented immigrants, which establishes a precedent for other states, which might eventually lead to, guessed it, a nationwide system of universal health care. Good news, bad news. Who knows? Had cancer patients tell me, I wouldn't wish cancer on anyone, but it has been a gift, a revelation. Back in the apocalypse in my life. Superseding binary judgment is part of taking a spiritual approach to our earthly conditions. Acknowledging that we don't know what we don't know, that there is a love force that is working in the world. And not only those malevolent entities the Apostle Paul called the principalities and powers. Really reminds us, out beyond our ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. That's a field where the mystic goes, where conventional morality and judgment of good and bad don't apply. Another important aspect of Wise Hope has to do with agency. I don't feel like I have to say a lot about this because we're Quakers here. Is hope really hope if it doesn't get me off the couch? I mean, I think we're back in Wishingville. Again, I believe in these wishes, so don't get me wrong. But, and I even believe in miracles because I believe that I've seen them. But we need a hope that gets up in the morning and puts on its overalls and goes to work in the world. I recently heard a Mary Oliver poem that I didn't know previously on the Carrie Newcomer and Parker Palmer podcast, The Growing Edge, highly recommend. Poem goes like this. It's called What I've Learned So Far. Meditation is old and honorable, So why should I not sit every morning of my life on the hillside looking into the shining world? Because properly attended to, delight, as well as havoc, good, bad, who knows, is a suggestion. Can one be passionate about the just, the ideal, the sublime, and the holy, and yet commit to no labor in its cause? I don't think so. All summations have a beginning. All effect has a story. All kindness begins with sown seed. Thought buds toward radiance. The gospel of light is the crossroads of indolence or action. Be ignited or be gone. We have to get ignited. I don't suppose that the idea that anyone who's passionate about the just, the ideal, and sublime, and the holy would commit some labor to its cause is in any way revelatory in this company. In fact, I think a fun exercise would be for us to do a little asset survey of all of the awesome stuff people in this room are involved in. But I want to make two quick points about our deep hope activism. One is affirmative and the other is a bit cautionary. First of all, the hope that moves its feet gives us more hope. If you do something to, say, save the whales, and there is really no perceptible increase in the safety of sedations, you will still feel more hopeful. And if you do that action of cetacean love, of whale care, in the company of others with a shared passion, you will find that it is contagious. And that community also gives you hope. This is where Teresa's reminder, we cannot do great things, only small things with great love, informs, enlightens, and enlivens us. We are not in charge of the outcome. Now, the cautionary point is that there is a Puritan legacy fallacy that one must be miserable, eagle-browed, angry, dour, cynical, judgmental, and finger-wagging in order to be a real activist in the world. Or to be woke. This does not serve us. It does not serve us as individuals. It does not serve us as a collective. It does not serve the life-sustaining society. This is the day that love has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. We must wait for the still small voice, love as first motion, to engage in the work that Spirit lays particularly on our heart. We must carry that love into our work and how we do that work. A burned out, joyless activist who judges and berates others is not doing their work from a centered place. Tikkun Olam's work, the healing of the world, is love made visible. And when it ceases to be that, so anyone know what I'm talking about? Can I get a witness? When it ceases to be that, we need to step back and take some time in quiet reflection. Maybe call together a clearness or an anchor committee. Now, what distinguishes human beings in our membership, do people want to jump up and like, yeah, let's do it. Let's do a tiny stretch break. I feel like I'm putting you all through it. We are incarnational beings. We live in these bodies. All right. So what distinguishes human beings in our membership is as members of what eco-philosopher Aldo Leopold called the biotic community, is our capacity for self-reflective consciousness. All right. We can watch ourselves think. We can watch ourselves hope even. We can choose wise hope intentionally as an operating principle, as a spiritual practice, as an orientation to existence, because it enables us to walk cheerfully over the world, answering that of God and everyone. Hopelessness is self-fulfilling, but hope is likewise. Tradition has Moses declaring in the book of Deuteronomy, "This day I call the heavens and the earth to witness against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life so that you and your children may live." Now choose life. Now consciously choose hope. Your spirit-led action is hope on the move. So back to the optimistical. See, we're winding towards the end of our map, right? When we arrive at a mystical awareness, a cosmic consciousness, God mind, the peace that passeth understanding, we have, in a sense, transcended even deep hope. Deep hope is a useful guide for me when I don't have access to being in that place of blessed assurance. It's that assurance that frees us from the fear, the hate, the judgment, the self-obsession, the defensiveness, the shame, the clinging, and the delusion. It can come to anyone, anywhere, at any time. But time spent in meditation, contemplation, prayer, and worship seem to open and prepare us for the sin-breaking spirit. In the Eternal Promise, a book that too few have read by Thomas Kelly, you know, the Testament of Devotion, he describes mystical at-one-ment this way. Power flows through us from the eternal into the rivulets of time. Amazed yet not amazed, we stride the stride of the tender giant who dwells within us, and wonders are performed. Active as never before, one lives in the passive voice, alert to be used, fearful of nothing, patient to stand and to wait. William James wrote one of the most widely regarded Western texts on mysticism in 1902. I had to study it in seminary. Not everything I studied in seminary was useless. And it was called The Varieties of Religious Experiences Studying Human Nature. In it, he gives 4 salient characteristics of the mystical experience, one of which is ineffability, which is we cannot adequately language the mystical experience, right? Because it occurs in a place beyond language. When we do try to language it, we have only the metaphors and the concepts and the language and theology that we have to try to capture it in words. So the Hindu calls it samadhi, and the Quaker might call it the inward Christ. All of the language is inadequate, but also necessary. And poets often come the closest. Perhaps that peace that passeth understanding has washed over you in waiting worship, or hoping worship. You sit down and you begin to center. A friend rises and speaks a message that goes directly to your heart. And you feel broken, open, and grateful, utterly beloved and at peace. And then suddenly the friend next to you is trying to shake your hand. Meeting's not over, it's only been 10 minutes, you want to protest. But looking at the clock, you see the meeting has actually gone a bit past the hour. Been in that liminal space where Chronos, clock time, which is not my friend right now, has given way to Kairos, to God's time. You've had an encounter, which we call a covered meeting. This peace finds many people in their time of dying in a very durable way, so that they come to live more in this stream of mystical consciousness than out of it. Mortality has finally put the howling ego in its place, and blocked passages or stuck baggage and entrenched ideas about self and existence soften and dissolve and move and make way for new revelation, perhaps joy. The last time that I saw a very dear patient, Sam, who had amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, which you say ALS, after 2.5 years of our journey together, I asked him how he was feeling inside himself. Painstakingly blinking at a grid of letters on a computer screen. Sam blinked twice at each of the letters that he wanted to choose as the retinal scanner followed the movement of his clear eyes. When he was done, he blinked at the little speaker icon, and an electronic voice intoned one word in response to my query. How are you feeling inside yourself? Said, fortunate. Yeah, fortunate. He died at home in his own bed 2 weeks later. I've come to believe that terminal illness sometimes replicates the experience that John Woolman had when he was so sick that he lay near death and heard the words, John Woolman is dead. He got better and came to understand that it was his will we would say ego, that had died. It died to self and been set free. My own journey to real faith came in my late 20s, when all of my own clever plans and manipulations had come to nothing. I had made myself alone and penniless and depressed and resentful. I discovered that trying to self-medicate depression with alcohol is like putting out a fire with gasoline. I could not climb out of that hole by my own will or cleverness. I was down from hope, which is the literal translation of the word despair. I had to surrender to despair or to God. And falling back on my Quaker upbringing, I surrendered to God. What is the weird thing? Friends, I never did climb out of that hole. You know, I fell out the bottom. And I found that I was borne up on angel's wings. Slowly, life came back into me. New energy and new companions for the journey. New meetings, new work, and a new grounding in spirit. Margaret Shepherd says, sometimes the only available transportation is a leap of faith. And that's where we are in the crumbles. Like cancer, like depression, like addiction, the crumbles invite us to apply this lesson that we learn when we go through a transition that feels like, or indeed is a kind of death or ending. We take up our cross and are tendered enough to open to spirit. The ultimate experience of being subsumed by Godness takes us to an optimistical consciousness. This is the balm that is sourced in Gilead. This is the rock to which our inward calm is secured in storm and ill. We've transcended good bad thinking, ceased to be lured by moralizing judgment, and accepted that we are not in control. But here's the thing. Ours is an optimistical faith. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Mysticism is the spiritual orientation that is based on direct experience of the mystery, oneness, cosmic love, sometimes anthropomorphized, sometimes called God. A mystical faith is based on the direct experience of the divine. That's why we sit in silence. We are waiting for the divine to enter in among us. Expectant waiting, and I've got to tell you, the word wait is related to the word hope. Expectant waiting, the word wait, hava, in Hebrew, is to bind together, to collect, to expect. In Spanish, the word wait is espere. You might hear aspire. And the word for hope is esperanza. Wait, espere, to hope, esperanza. Our waiting worship is hoping worship. Hoping that Spirit will come here into this place to touch us and heal us, to cover us and connect us one to the other into a whole. We could have been called the religious society of hope. I'm not seriously proposing that you realize you're correct. So Quaker adjacent, Howard Thurman wrote, in the stillness of the quiet, if we listen, we can hear the whisper of the heart giving strength to weakness, courage to fear, hope to despair. Cosmic hope, this cosmic hope, born of direct experience, sometimes follows the path of the via negativa. I think we considered, hold on a second. Let me listen for a second. Okay, sorry. Consider this well-known quote, where profound despair, again, a word that means without hope, down from hopelessness, where despair leads to joy. But as I had forsaken the priests, so I left the separate preachers also, and those esteemed the most experienced people, for I saw there was none among them that could speak to my condition. That's despair. Imagine that you've been to all the doctors and all the medical specialists and all of the experts, and they still couldn't tell you what was making you so sick or what you might do about It goes on. And when all my hopes in them and in all men were gone, so that I had nothing outwardly to help me, nor could tell what to do, then, oh then, I heard a voice which said, there is one, even Christ Jesus. You can translate Christ Jesus to divine mystery. That helps you. There is one, even divine mystery, that can speak to thy condition. And when I heard it, my heart did leap for joy. That is the exegetical kernel of Quakerism. That's the moment in Fox's life when the movement was born. We were forged in that pit of despond and went from despair to joy just exactly in the moment that was darkest. An important aspect of our optimistical faith that I want to highlight is Quakers were, and to some extent are still, preposterously optimistic about the potential of human perfection as a process, not as a rigid state, and tikkun olam, which is repairing or healing the world into the peaceable kingdom. Fox said, now as I come up in spirit to the flaming sword into the paradise of God, all things were new, and all the creation gave another smell unto me than before, beyond what words can utter. Remember how I said you have that mystical experience and it's beyond language, but this is the language that he tried to explain to his fellow travelers. The flaming sword is the sword that's held in the fist of the angel that was set at the gate of Eden when humanity was kicked out to keep us out of paradise. He came up through the flaming sword into the paradise of God. He reversed that exile. If you don't like that original sin thing, I encourage you to read some cosmologies from other cultures. A break in the world is a very common feature. I'm in real trouble now. Hold on a second. All right. Okay, so Quakerism itself is not immune to the problems. Our numbers are dwindling, meetings are laid down, our work is sometimes inward and mundane. We quibble over new chairs or the wording of a minute that we don't really agree about. And we agonize over when and where we might be, whether to be on Zoom or in person. And in recent years, we have open to accepting that despite our track record and our deeply held testimony of equality, we're about as diverse as a typical country, suburban country club. We raise our kids only for most of them to leave the meeting. Hopefully they hold on to their Quaker values as they go. We seem no longer to be a laboratory for things like abolition of slavery or women's suffrage or public radio or the co-op movement or conscientious objectors or Greenpeace, all of which Quakers gave life to.
Yeah.
Well, death is part of life, and perhaps Quakerism will die. I don't know. But death is only a transition, it's only an apocalypse, a revelation of something new. You have to be ready to change, to listen. Quakerism has only ever been a means to an end. It's not an end unto itself. And that end is direct communion with the divine. Quakerism is not serving that purpose of drawing us into godness, but perhaps it should yield to some new revelation. We're freed up by being able to entertain that possibility. Perhaps part of our Quaker crumbles is because Quakerism has succeeded too well. The Quaker belief that there's out of God in everyone is a commonplace today. Well, there's lots of other instances that I'm going to skip. Quakerism is, after all, a story. It's a narrative. It's a story that my life is woven into. My life goes on in endless song, in the song of creation, but the particular harmony that resonates in the cello of my soul is this radical faith, this possibility, this evolving exploration of the mystery that we call Quakerism. The water of spirit flows all over the world, land and water and sea, but Quakerism is my watershed. It's my home place. Here is the holy ground where my roots go down so that I may stand in the storm that is coming. So, and this is not in the interest of time, this is my reality. That is what I got. It doesn't seem to be a neat ending to this piece of ministry. I tried and it was totally horrible. And outrunning one's guide is what we traditionally call that. So to recap, we're living in the tumbles, great unraveling, a precursor to the great turning. Starting with befriending our grief, if you get little of, you can cultivate and practice deep hope and wise hope. Remembering that things are not going back to normal, that we don't know what we don't know, and that new possibilities are made possible as things fall apart. Optimisticism is not that easy to say, and your spell checker will hate it. Is the profound hope comes from surrender and right sizing of the ego and the direct encounter with God, which reframes entirely both what hope is and what we hope for. It enables radical witness. Ours is an optimistical faith. Quakerism also has the crumbles, but may just be on the cusp of a profound transformation. We are the inheritors and stewards of this gift, and that may be a great adventure.